Welcome to EPG Pathshala program. I'm Dr. Melissa Helen from Osmania University. Today we are going to look at a module from African and Caribbean literature. And we are going to take a closer look at a novel titled Palace of the Peacock by Theodore Wilson Harris. Theodore Wilson Harris was actually born in British Guyana, now it's called as Guyana, in the year 1921. Now he is a resident of England, but then he is included in the canon of Caribbean literature because Harris graduated from Queen's College in Georgetown, which is the capital of Guyana. Harris has been greatly influenced by his life and experiences in Guyana. He studied land surveying and geomorphology in Guyana, and he also worked for some time as a government surveyor, and therefore he led a number of expeditions into the deep Amazonian forests in the interior places of Guyana. And we find this experience reflected in many of his work. Harris also writes fiction, non-fiction, and critical essays that he has taught at several places in the world. He has developed a concept of an African tradition in the novel. It's interesting to know that Wilson Harris, a Caribbean writer, taught at the University of Mysore in India. He was awarded honorary doctorates by University of West Indies, University of Leeds, and then he won the Guyana Prize for Literature twice. And in the year 2010, he was also conferred the knighthood by Queen Elizabeth II. Some of his works include 3 volumes of poetry and then other fiction titled Fetish, The Well and the Land, and The Eternity to Season. The Guyana Quartet comprises his first 4 novels: Palace of the Peacock, The Far Journey of Auden, The Whole Armor, and The Secret Ladder. Well, if you want to have an idea about some of the features of his work, remember I told you Harris developed his own concept of writing the the African tradition of fiction. So he is known for some unique narrative techniques. One of the features you have to remember when you are reading any fiction from Harris is his unconventional plot structure and narrative strategies. Let me repeat, he is known for an unconventional plot structure, and the narrative strategies are very different from what we come across the traditional English novels. Another narrative technique you have to remember is he tends to have a blurring of the different states of consciousness. That is, the dream states and the states of reality, waking, do get blurred in his writings. And we will take a closer look at this point in relation to the novel Palace of the Peacock. And then another interesting feature of his novels is the setting. Most of the times they are set in either in the cities, villages, or jungles of the Guyana or along the Amazonian River. It forms a constant backdrop. Another interesting aspect of his work is the characters that you come across in his fiction. They are of Amerindian or African or English descent. That means the characters in his novels are not totally African, not English, not Amerindians, but they are diverse in nature. Well, a few points you have to remember in general that are related to Harris' works. He is someone who is concerned with myth and how myths that are written across the world can help us mediate the binary cultures. Particularly when we talk about the binary cultures, we have to keep in mind that the Western colonial ideology has imposed upon us the binary nature of black and white, West and East, Oriental and Occidental. But then Harris always believes that there can be some kind of a reconciliation of these seemingly contradictory differences of humanity. Some of his themes include conquest and colonization, the struggles of the colonized people, the clash of cultures, and also how we can have some kind of an identity forged between native and foreign culture. Amidst this binary nature of world and mankind, Harris believes that mankind with these oppositions can be redeemed with some kind of reconciliation. Well, to take a closer look at the Palace of the Peacock, this was the first one of the 4 novels in the Guyana Quartet. And incidentally, this is also the first novel to be published in 1960 after he came to England. What is the novel basically about? Well, this describes the experience of a crew of non-natives who travel along the river Amazon into the innermost settlements of Guyana. What do we find in the novel? It is an expedition, and we find a series of tragedies. The captain is Dunne, D-O-N-N-E. He is the one who exploits the natives. He is a European, and this is representative of the large discrimination of racism and the binaries between the colonizer and the colonized world. To give you a quick idea about the characters in the novel, we have a narrator, and Dunne, who is a non-native plantation slave owner, and we have Cameron, Schomburg, Carroll, Vigilance, who is an Indian, Jennings, who works as a mechanic on the ship, and then we have 2 twins from Portugal, we have Wishrop, and we have one woman. The only one woman is a native Arawak woman, and her name is Mariella. The novel is divided into 12 chapters, and it's a short novel, so we call it as a novella. And the novella, though it is having only 12 chapters, is divided into or subdivided into 4 books, and each book begins with a quotation which has a lot of meaning. Now, why is there a division of these books? Because this shadows or foretells the various stages of their symbolic journey that takes place through reflections. And these 4 books offer or give us a chance to introspect and have a new understanding of many things in life. Well, let's begin with book 1. It is titled Horseman Pass By. The purpose of the book, basically, book 1, is to introduce us to the plot. What do we find? As I said already, we come across a boat that is journeying up the river through the Guyanese rainforest. And it begins with a dream by the narrator. And in this dream, you come across a horseman who is riding at a great speed, and this horseman is shot to death. And the book also introduces us to the obfuscation or the blurring of the binaries of life and death. The dream of the horseman being shot to death is actually prophetic of the events that unfold on the rest of the journey. This also indicates that Dunne is likely to meet a fatal death at the hands of either the woman or the natives. But then we come across the narrator being woken up from his dream or sleep by an insistent rapping on his door by Dunne. And the narrator now recollects Dunn's wild exploits at school, for which he was eventually expelled. As the narrator he comes across Dunn's cruel treatment of his mistress. You come across the fact that Dunn has a native woman as his mistress who is ill-treated, who has a lot of bruises and scars all on her body. And then Dunn himself acknowledges that his life was tough. As a plantation slave owner, he tells he has to fight everything in nature. Nature, flood, drought, chicken, hawk, rat, beast, and woman. Dunn reminisces to the narrator their childhood. Let me clarify, Dunn and the narrator happen to be brothers. So he reminisces their childhood to the narrator who happens to be the brother. He recollects their parents' economic condition, their poverty, and also the fact that their early death brought in a nightmare, and how Dunn was enforced to take up a parental responsibility and be a parent to the narrator. So he tells his brother, the narrator, of his progress as a man when he has learned to rule the savannas or these plantations. Through intermittent states of dream and consciousness, the first book ushers in the story element. That is, basically, Dunn, as a violent taskmaster, he tries to exploit the natives for his avarice. And what is his greed? To build a palace and make a name for himself. So that is how you find the title of the novella, Palace of the Peacock, having some significance right at the beginning. Well, in book 2, which is titled The Mission of Mariella, Mariella is actually a place. So the crew reach the village called Mariella or Inside, which is a colony of Amerindians, the locals or the natives. But as soon as Dunn and his crew reach this village, the news of the arrival of Dunn as a slave owner spreads around like wildfire around the colony. And you know what? Before they could tie the boat securely to the bank and then get hold of some slaves to work on the plantation, all the people, the natives, including the young children who had been playing and scrambling near the houses, abandoned the village and run away into the interior parts of the forest. So Dunn and the crew have no option but they spend a night in this village which is deserted. And where do they spend? In their hammocks. So the narrator vividly recalls that every grey hammock was an empty cocoon, as hollow and as a deserted shell. As he sleeps once again, the narrator has hallucinations and dreams in which the narrator encounters some kind of a struggle or a tussle with strange bees. In the uncertain grey light, the grey light always is obfuscating whether it's a grey light in his mind or dream or is it reality. So he was wondering whether it was a dog or a horse, the beast that he was fighting with in his hallucination. But then it appears to be a half wolf, half donkey. It is neighing and barking. As he attempts to mount on this beast suddenly shrinks into a half woman and half log. And the narrator raises his hand to cajole its aging, soulful face. Later we learn that Dunn and Da Silva's twin, one of the twins that I referred to among the characters, are successful in finding someone to guide them to the interior of the jungle. You see, these are not natives, so they wouldn't know where these natives had disappeared and how to really get in touch with them and force them back to be their slaves. So Dunn almost brings or forces an old Arawak woman to be their guide because she's the only woman available in the village, which is deserted by everyone. As his brother, that is the narrator, looks at Dunn, he wonders at the picture that Dunn presented of himself. Dunn looks like an apparition, a ghost, with his eyes sunken, and he appears to be impatient in rage. But at the same time, he is burning with the intensity of horror and ambition. So when he brings this Arawak woman, old wrinkled woman, to be their guide, he addresses the crew to begin the journey. This echoes or reminds us of The Heart of Darkness written by Joseph Conrad, where a similar theme is dealt with. Now this woman, the old Arawak woman, who is their only hope of helping them to find where the villagers disappeared into the forest, she tells them that if they take a 7-day journey up the river, they will be able to find the natives. But then one of the crew members, Schomburg, is the first one to really understand the risk and the imminent danger involved in the search. Jennings also warns them that they were fortunate in reaching the village, and this would be a really bad time of the year to go up on the river. So some of the crew were divided in not really considering it as an appropriate time. However, despite the mixed reactions from the crew, Dunn forces to start on the mission in search of the natives. The third book is aptly titled as The Second Death. The crew that was earlier fortunate in escaping the first death on their journey to this village Mariella is now embarking on the most challenging mission on this 7-day trip up the river. The third book is also the longest one of the novel, and it reveals their struggles up the stream. And it also records the death of a number of the crewmen through the straits of memory. This book gives details about Carroll, one of the crew members, and his family. You come across a lot of personal incidents. The readers are introduced to a new member of the crew, that is the old Arawak woman. Let me read how Harris describes this woman. She sat, I quote, crumpled looking, like a curious ball, old and wrinkled, as a bowing statue. The stillness and surrender of the American Indian of Guyana. She belonged to a race that neither forgave nor forgot. Unquote. So after the first day of their journey, the dreaming narrator and the crew are caught in between memory and wakefulness, dreams and reality. As the novel continues in the voice of an omniscient narrator, we find the crew is caught up in the sudden dreaming fury of the stream. That is, the stream suddenly becomes, the river becomes very, very violent and the river is agitated. It is so disturbing that the river appears to be a combination of an earthquake and a volcano. And this fills them with terror. Maybe in our times, in our situation, we might consider it like a tsunami. They enter a particular place called War Office Rapids up the river. And then each begins to wonder looking at the storm that is raised on the sea, they wonder who the Jonah is. Well, if you don't know what the meaning of Jonah is, refer to the book of Jonah in the Bible. Jonah is a prophet who is asked by God to go into a particular country, but then he disobeys God, and so God sends a terrible storm. So in this context, because of this heavy storm, all the crew members are wondering who Jonah is and whose mistake it is that they are caught in this violent storm. And then everybody wonders and begins to suspect Dunn as Jonah, because he is the one who can be blamed for capturing this woman who is almost like a witch. The first tragedy strikes when Carol, the youngest of the crew, gets up to help steer the boat, because it's a very, very difficult, strenuous time. So as he's trying to steer the boat in the best possible manner, he slips and falls into the water and dies. The second tragedy strikes very mysteriously. Carol's father, Schomburg, dies in his sleep. And then Schomburg was actually working as an interpreter, because the Arawak woman only knows the native language. And Schomburg's death leaves them at a loss, because they cannot communicate with the Arawak woman for further directions. So they are in terrible situation. However, as Dunn put forward his plan, amidst hesitation from Jennings, the crew decide to continue their journey. But then, raging torrents of the river are like the boiling stream and the furnace of an endless life without beginning and end. They all look like inspired madmen, because they are making all their efforts only to realize, unfortunately, that the boat struck a rock. And the boat is now the vessel of their second death. A boat which should help them travel across to life and to safety, now because it's stuck by a rock, turns out to be their vessel of death. Well, the descriptions of the turbulent river and the landscape have a symbolic as well as a realistic meaning. As we continue through the book 3, we come across that Jennings dies in a fall. Cameron is stabbed to death by another De Silva twin. Wishrop, who is training at the engine, also meets his watery grave in the maelstrom. Finally, on the 7th day, when the boat was totally wrecked and almost all the crew members are dead, except, again mysteriously, Vigilance, the survivor, who disappears mysteriously with the old native Arawak woman. The Arawak woman, incidentally, her name is also Mariella. The name of the village was Mariella, and the Arawak woman's name is also Mariella. Vigilance disappears with Mariella. The dreaming narrator gains a new perspective with all the havoc and the destruction and the catastrophe. And he offers a substance of the mission in the last book. The last or the fourth book is titled Paling of Ancestors. Paling, P-A-L-I-N-G. It comes from the word pale. This leads us into a confused state, because the journey and the dream both advance to a conclusion. What is a conclusion to a journey in which almost everybody has lost their life? Amidst vision, Dunn enters the palace that he was hoping to build. As he enters his monument, he realizes that nothing had any significance And his dreams of building a palace and making a name for himself, his conquest, was actually a threadbare as the clothes of the woman in his vision. That is, he has a vision of a woman. And then he realizes that all his life he loved no one but himself. And then he also realizes that his journey and his life was nothing but a fantasy. It was his blindness that made him see his own nothingness and imagination that he constructed beyond his reach. He realizes that it was a futile and a vain attempt. So at the end of the novel, Harris uses the medium of music as a harmony to bring in an epiphany. What is an epiphany? Epiphany or epiphanic moment, we say, is a moment of revelation. A revelation when the surviving crew realize, that is, Dunn and the narrator realize that the inconsequential nature of their conquest and material wealth. So the novel ends with Harris' vision of the possible harmony of several binaries. And the novel ends on the hope of the possibility of Harris' vision. What is a vision? It's a new vision that we can have a true community. A community that includes all the various elements of Guyana. And that is why we have characters from all the backgrounds included in the novel. Well, we also find that the distinction between the peacock and the palace, dream and consciousness, illusion and reality, soul and flesh, all these binaries of life, material and spiritual, time and eternity, savanna and forest, are actually presented as one entity. This is what has made Harris as a very, very complex novelist to read and understand at the first instance. What are the themes in the novel? Well, we have to realize that Harris is trying to help show us that introspection and a confrontation with our past, like Dunn really had to face, can help us have a purgatory effect. And Harris is also trying to help us realize that one needs to have a reorientation in thinking. Another interesting point is it helps us to realize that there is a possibility of rebirth and new beginnings despite all the catastrophes and the illusions that we encounter and harbor in life. In a nutshell, we can say that as the narrator goes through different stages of reality, hallucinations and dreams, he confronts his own illusions and fears. And then he finally understands that his experience is not restricted to Dunn or the crew alone, but this experience has a greater significance because it can be related to the experience of all mankind at large. Now, to look at some of the important elements of the novel. In the novel, symbolism is an important issue. Peacock, as we come across in the title, is an important symbol that's used by Harris. Peacock, incidentally, is the national bird of India. Peacock is rich and multifarious in its meanings and colors. It represents, or it is symbolic of, the different colors and religions. And in general, peacock stands for beauty, glory, royalty and immortality. The fact that the rich and the multiple colors of a peacock make it beautiful tell us or present to us Harris' vision of a unified society. It is not the whites or it is not the blacks, but it is the Arawak, the native, the Amerindians, the French, the British, the Indians, all these of different hues and colors and natures and nations, which create a unified society and the world at large. And Peacock also, the symbolism, helps us to have an understanding, a better understanding of the world at large. So Harris is trying to use the symbol of a peacock to help us realize that we need to have an integration. Today we are all fighting for so many minor small differences. But then Harris has a wonderful vision of arguing for the integration of all the sections and all the races of the world in general, and more so particularly in Guyana, because there are a lot of indigenous groups and tribes and different people in Caribbean and Guyana. On another level, the symbolism of peacock also helps us to realize that the palace that the crew, particularly Dan, was hoping to reach at the end of the journey is actually nothing but a phantasm, and it leaves them with a destruction of their own selves. Dan, the narrator, stands as a symbol or as a type for all the exploiting European civilization. You can recollect it with, or connect it with Kurtz in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. The crew represent the major racial groups of post-colonial Guyana. Well, on another level, the symbolism works because the journey itself is symbolic of the exploration of their identity of the true selves. So only at the end of the 7-day journey, they realize that it has only been an illusion and a vanity and futility. The 7-day journey also is resonating the 7-day period of creation as we come across in the first book of the Bible titled Genesis. But then, after 6 days of creation in the Bible, on the 7th day, God rested. And when God created everything the first 6 days, he said it was good. So in the novel here, this 7-day journey is actually destructive, and therefore we can say it is anti-Genesis. But on the other hand, we can say that the symbolic journey, however anti-Genesis and destructive it is, it becomes the Bildungsroman for the narrator, because the narrator comes out as an enlightened man, though after a huge loss of the lives of all his crew members. When it comes to plot, Harris rejected the traditional mainstream 19th century English novel of persuasion, because basically the traditional English novel always had a linear line of time and plot and characters. But then you come across that there is no plot that is really beginning and gradually developing and coming to a conclusion. We go back and forth. And he adopted many new techniques and ideas. As I have already mentioned, the breakdown of the binary divisions, dream and reality. He tries to present a paradox of life in death and death in life phenomenon. At the beginning of the novella, we come across the dreaming narrator. He speaks of himself as one dead seeing eye. How can it be possible? One dead eye, but it is a seeing eye. And then another contradiction. He says one living closed eye. It is a living eye, but it's a closed eye. So we have a lot of binaries and then contrasts being presented to us, because Harris, as an Caribbean or an African writer wanted to break away from the traditional mainstream English novel. When it comes to the narrative technique that Harris uses in his fiction, there is no single point of view. The first book of the 3 chapters sets in motion the expedition of Dunn as well as the narrative techniques of Wilson Harris. What do we mean by the narrative techniques? The narrator wakes up from his sleep or the dream that he had been having or experiencing to meet his brother Dunn. So the ambiguity of whether it is a dream or a reality and the different states of consciousness adds to the complexity of understanding the narrative. We don't know whether it is a dream that's being continued or a waking state that Dunn is trying to tell us. And then we also come across the shifting of the narrative voice from the first person I and a third person point of view. This is a technique of binary breakdowns. The palace is an illusion. It points out to the superficiality of illusions of opposites that separated them. Now, to come to the language used by Wilson Harris. The English spoken by the multiracial characters differs from each other. To quote from the novel itself, Dunn, as an Englishman or as a colonizer, his language is flawless, perfect. When he says, I quote, "Life here is tough. One has to be a devil to survive. I am the last landlord." On the other extreme, you have the pidgin variety of the English language, and it is seen in the dialogue between Cameron and Da Silva, the Portuguese twin. I quote, "I is a fool, yes, a foolish dead man, but I, seeing me parrot, is no vulture bird." So as diverse as the characters, Harris also makes sure that the language is diverse. Some of the greatness of Harris lies in his contribution to myth making and twinning or combination of two different ideologies or myths. Why does he resort to this twinning or combining of characters? Because that helps him to create new myths. For example, I told you that Mariella is the name of the village, and Mariella is also the native old Arawak woman. And then another example, in between page 23 of the novel, you'll come across this line, narrator and Dunn get intertwined. So the distinction between who is the narrator and who is Dunn gets blurred. I quote the line, "He was myself standing outside of me while I stood inside of him." So there seems to be some kind of a twinning between Dunn and his brother, who is the narrator. The narrator also awakes to find himself in what appears to be an operating theatre. One of his dreams, he just realizes it's an operating theatre. And then he also begins to wonder if it's a maternity ward or a prison cell. And then in chapter 5, I already mentioned it to you, he comes across fighting against strange beasts, half wolf, half donkey, half women. How can a half woman be also a half log, which is inanimate? Dunn, the leader, utters a loud cry and tries to bring back the dead crew to life. This actually echoes two myths of shouting back to life. And this is associated with, once again, Bible and the ancient Greek mythology. In Bible, the book of Ezekiel, you come across the prophet Ezekiel standing in the valley of bones. Across the valley of bones, God tells the prophet to speak to these valley full of bones. And as Ezekiel the prophet speaks, all the bones gather together and form into human beings. And then there is a breath of life, and then they take the shape of human beings. But then this notion of bones are done uttering a loud cry also resonates with the notion of Caribbean bone flute. You will find a bone flute picture on one of your slides. A Caribbean bone flute, according to their mythology and other cultures, the ancient Caribs possessed a bone flute, that is, a flute made from the body of the enemy whom they killed. The flute is also linked to the notion of the seed of music, music that is played with a reed pipe and the flute. Harris also creates a new myth. In the tableau, or a kind of a pageant or a show that is presented, so towards the end of the novel, he comes across a vision in which you have a tableau with a carpenter and a woman and a child. But all these are actually reminiscent of carpenter stands for Joseph, woman stands for Mary, the Madonna, and the child stands for Christ. But then Harris does not convey this kind of a picture. He creates a new myth, that is with a difference. Because this woman that Donne sees is a woman wearing a long sweeping garment. And the whole room reflects the threadbare, glistening garment. It is a new vision, and it is a retelling of the old myth of Madonna that enumerates Harris' new vision. That is, a new vision of myth making and creating new visions that comprise two different or two opposing or two binaries in life. Well, to talk about the landscape, as I told you at the beginning of the model, the Amazonian forests are all reflected here. The characters and the landscape also often reflect each other. The landscape plays an important role in the shaping of the characters. The Crow fight their way up the raging river. Schomburg and the Da Silva twins come from a place called Sorrow Hill. And then let me read out for you a description of the old Arawak native woman who appeared actually like a witch. Follow very carefully. Let me quote. Tiny embroideries resembling the handwork of the Arawak woman's kerchief, and the wrinkles on her brow turned to incredible and fast, soundless breakers of foam. Her crumpled bosom and river grew agitated with desire. The ruffles in the water were her dress rolling. Close quotation. You see, is Harris describing the woman or is he describing the river? Both are almost twined into each other. Thus, the novel abounds with a rich description of the land, river, and people, which is highly and richly symbolic. Now, let me conclude. What is it that Harris is trying to tell us in this brief novel? He is trying to argue that the notion of a nationhood is a challenge for Guyana, because Guyana has a lot of diversity, racial, ethnic, and religious groups. Guyana was colonized like India. But then, though we also had a few from French and Portuguese and others, but we were heavily influenced by the British colonizers. Unlike to the Indian situation, Guyana was colonized by the British, the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch. So you find a lot of influence of these four colonizers. So these four colonizers and their influence, coupled with the diversities of the racial, ethnic, and religious groups, is difficult for Guyana to have a one nation. See, in modern times, the notion of nation is very, very crucial. The question of identity comes from the nation. So, Harris is trying to argue that it is very, very difficult for Guyana to have a concept of a simplified notion of a nation because of its rich, composite, and diverse nature. And that is why he uses peacock as a symbol. So we can conclude that Harris' works address universal issues. In the world of globalization that we are living in today, people traveling and moving across, it is difficult for us also to have an idea of a pure nation, because we will come across diverse elements all over wherever we are. So Harris' work does have a lot of relevance and application to us even today, because Harris addresses issues that are universal, particularly in the modern LPG world of liberalization, privatization, and globalization, where we have multiculturalism. And he tries to convey a positive and a life-affirming outlook by emphasizing that all the superficial nature that is divided on the basis of race, color, ethnicity, religion, and culture can actually undergo a metamorphosis and become a unified composite structure. Not one single entity, but a composite unified culture. And then Harris is also trying to convey to us that, like his protagonist, we all have to realize that in this modern world, whatever we chase at times as ideal might end up only as a phantasm, and we might be coming across whatever our achievements as something highly insignificant at the end. So we have to make sure that, unlike Donne, we should not live for ourselves. So whatever Donne realized at the end of the novel, we can realize right at the beginning and avoid some of the flaws that Donne had. Thank you, and I hope you have enjoyed listening and learning from this module.